Welcome back to the program. The now executive editor of the American Prospect, and I can't encourage everyone and anyone more to go over there and get a subscription to the American Prospect. I am so excited to see what's going to happen going forward with this. And Prospect I've read, for years, and David Dayan, welcome to the program. I was just, talking about you that
I'm going to let you do that.
Well,
I'm just going to let you keep doing that.
I've been reading the Prospect for years, and it was, sometimes great, sometimes not so interesting to me. There a bunch of interesting pieces over the years, obviously, and we've had guests on from there. But I am so excited to have you this be your new job. Not only have you're way overdue for a job like this, but frankly, I'm very excited to see where this goes. I mean, I interviewed Bill Lazonick on a piece that he wrote the other day about we've been talking to Bill Lazonick for years on this program about what's happened with CEOs and their executive pay and the way that they get paid and the shareholder buybacks. And he tied it into the 737 stuff, and it's fascinating, and only in the American Prospect.
Yeah, that was a good piece. We're excited about the way forward. Prospect obviously has been around for 30 years, has a really rich legacy. You could probably name any major media site in journalism, and someone, if not multiple people from the Prospect and their past have worked there, whether you're talking about Ezra Klein or Matt Iglesias or Jamel Bowie or Adam Serwer or Nick Confessore or whoever. And we're looking to continue that legacy and move it forward. We're looking at hiring new writers. We're looking at there's going to be a redesign of the website. There's going to be, I think, an increased focus on the kinds of things that I write about regularly, which are really power dynamics, whether you're talking about politics or you're talking about business. Talking about the economy, I'm really excited to build something that I think will make a contribution.
Great. Well, let's talk about a couple of pieces that you actually wrote about in the Prospect this past week, both of which, we talked about on the program early this week to a certain extent, not as in depth as you covered here. And I want to also touch on Biden's reversal and what you make of that as well. But you were out at the California Democratic Convention. And basically wrote about how almost everyone there on some level or another was distinguishing themselves from Joe Biden, who seems to feel like the strategy to win the nomination and maybe the presidency is to run like it's 1995.
I'd say more like 1900. William McKinley did his famous front porch campaign where he never left his front porch, and well-wishers came to him. That was the sum total of his campaigning. Obviously in 1900 it might have been a little harder to traverse the country, but Biden apparently doesn't know of the existence of planes or large halls where you could speak one-on-one to candidates. There is very little campaigning going on in the first couple months, and it seems like Biden wants to get out of his own way and not screw it up. And really, if you look at this week, that's probably a good bet, right? I mean, he comes out for the Hyde Amendment and then has to backtrack, and so staying out of the public eye is probably a good idea for Joe Biden, given his history with presidential campaigns.
Well, isn't this going to be a problem for him? I mean, this is what and I want to get your sense of this, and because maybe I'm completely off base, but this is going to catch up with him. Like, I mean, to a certain extent, there was a little bit of that Clinton tried to do early on in her campaign. I think the DNC scheduling all the debates in 2016 on the weekends was also a function of this on some level, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that they wanted to sort of basically, run like an incumbents race on some level. But Joe Biden is not.
I mean, and by the way, it's not like it's breaking new ground or anything. This is what most front runners do. They try to limit their exposure, because if you're winning, the only thing that can happen is to the downside. So, why wouldn't you, to a certain extent? But I don't think it's sustainable. I mean, Biden's not going to skip these debates, right? And that's going to be sort of the most high profile thing. We're going to see those in just a matter of weeks here. And there are going to be plenty of moments that can change this dynamic. And it's certainly not sustainable for him to just sort of, stay out of the public eye for the rest of this campaign on to, 2020.
Did the California convention, it seems to me, marked in some ways, the beginning of the race. I don't want to say the race as much as, but like the idea that like, okay, we're running against Joe Biden here.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, except for a couple like, Hickenlooper and Delaney trying to run against socialism or whatever. Right. But for the most part, this was the kickoff, I feel like, of the campaign. Now, there's another one this week. There's a cattle call in Iowa. But there were 14 candidates over in San Francisco. And the ones with a real shot to win did set up this argument, particularly around not just Biden, but I've been calling it Bidenism. This, and it's not limited to him, but this sort of establishment idea that what we need is a restoration presidency. We need a return to normalcy, as Warren Harding ran on in 1920. We just need to get Trump out of there, and everything will be all right, and we all can go back to brunch. And what the argument that and not limited to just sort of the candidates on the progressive side, but versions of this were said by Booker and Buttigieg, in addition to Warren and Sanders, that's not going to be enough. That the history of the recent history within our country of an economy that doesn't lift everyone up, that's a climate crisis, and all of these various things that are pushing up inequality and giving the middle class less opportunities to make it, those things existed before Donald Trump, and they're going to exist after him. And we need to structurally make some changes in order to remedy that, because it's the clear challenge facing the country. And a go slow, try to make compromise, don't fight too hard kind of approach is not what we need at this time. I mean, Warren had that great line when she said, if someone, a politician, is telling you that you don't make waves, you can't do everything at once, you go slow, what they're really telling you is they're not going to fight for you,
right,
when you're when the chips are down, and that's really the argument. That's the argument that was set up, and that's the argument I think you're going to see on display in a few weeks in these presidential debates.
Do you think we're going to see more? I mean, I've been sort of surprised, and I haven't seen any reactions to Biden's flip here. And, I think, look, I don't think it's any secret that Biden is my least favored candidate in this race. Although maybe John Delaney and there's a couple others there. But
I mean, does he rise to the level of being a favorite or not, like John Delaney or John Hickenlooper? I mean,
right.
It was so funny to see. Nobody was paying attention to those speeches when they were being made until the word socialism came up. It was almost like a wake word, like an Alexa. Socialism was said, and then people, turned their heads up. The only thing worse than getting booed is not being paid attention to at all, and that's what was happening prior to that, and I suspect that's what will continue to happen after Delaney and Hickenlooper's 15 minutes of being booed.
Do you think that's why they did it? Do you think that's
why?
I mean,
I think it's absolutely why Hickenlooper did it. He ran ads about it afterwards. He went on a little tour of the media afterwards. Delaney might just be clueless. I don't really know. But Hickenlooper, it was a considered strategy and one that we've seen in California. In 1990, Dianne Feinstein was running for governor, actually, and she was in a primary, and she came out in favor of the death penalty very strongly at a California Democratic Party convention, was lustily booed, and then she used that footage in an ad during the campaign. She actually ended up losing. She did not become California governor, and later on she became senator. But this is a strategy. I mean, you can call it sister soldier or whatever. Of course, Clinton did that after the nomination was locked up, not when he was trying to get Democratic votes. So I don't think it's a successful strategy.
All right. So getting back, here's my question about Biden. Are we going to see some of these candidates, or is it too early for this to start to hit Biden? Like on this, there seems to me to be two things, right, that Biden is vulnerable to. One is the idea that he inevitably can win, and the other is that he needs to be on some level cleaved from his association with Barack Obama, and that's difficult for some of the candidates who were critical about some of Obama's thing and Obama's policies, and I imagine that they don't want to. Be too, the way that they would cleave these guys is tricky. But Joe Biden came out, weeks ago and said, I'm going to be able to, after Donald Trump is gone, I'm going to be able to deal with the Republicans. And right. Isn't sort of like the implication there that Barack Obama couldn't do it, but I can? I mean, if I wanted to cleave Joe Biden from Barack Obama, I would say, I would pose the question, why does Joe Biden think that he is able to do what Barack Obama couldn't do? And
that's one way to do it. I think the other way to do it is just to say, open your eyes, Joe. I mean, look at what the blockade that we've seen. And going back even before Obama, right? Going to the Clinton administration or since the Reagan Revolution, what in that history is something that you think you can find common ground on? I mean, this is insane, and that's ultimately going to be a dynamic that is not going to get the American public to a place where they need to be. I think that's probably a better way of putting it to a Democratic audience. I mean, I think we get a little caught up too much in Obama's role in all of this. Clearly that Biden is running on that affinity. I mean, he's running on that affiliation with Obama. I mean, it's notable that Obama aides aren't really running with him. There are plenty of not just fundraising support, but actual former aides who are looking at other candidates. But what I would say is that you can just sort of look at the reality of where the Republican Party has gone over the last 40 years and just look incredulously at anyone thinking that there's some place of common ground that you can find.
What do we know about how they're going to be picking the who's on which stage during these debates? Because that seems to me to be also pretty
the
important.
Lottery, as far as I know, it's a luck of the draw situation, and that's pretty important. I mean, at least for this first one. Now, later debates are going to have less members in it. The DNC has come out and said that they're raising the bar for whether you can participate in these debates in the future. And so eventually there will be a debate with the top candidates taking the stage, Biden and Warren and Harris and Sanders and Buttigieg. This one is all luck of the draw. So, Biden could get in there with a bunch of people polling at 2% or less. I mean, it's entirely possible.
Wow.
There is no, maybe the DNC will put their thumb on the scale in some way. I don't know if this is a public process of drawing lots or anything, but it's certainly unpredictable. And if you don't have Biden and Warren in the same debates, then there's going to be a different dynamic if you don't have Biden and Sanders in the same debate.
I think we should be starting a call right now to have that be a public process. Something like, the way they do the lottery numbers on, Channel 5 or whatever it is. When they pull it out of a...
well, it's like the NBA draft lottery.
Yeah.
Right? That's done in a back room, and then the Knicks end up with Patrick Ewing.
Why wouldn't you do that if you were the DNC? That would be a brilliant, I think, social media strategy, unless, of course, you really wanted to make sure that Joe Biden didn't end up on the stage with anybody who's going to challenge him in a sort of a material.
From a pure ratings standpoint, you'd think that they would want to do the opposite, that they would want to get all their big names in the same debate. But they've been pretty adamant that they didn't want to do a kiddie table kind of debate like the Republicans did in 2016.
I think that's fair enough. I think that's fair enough, at least at the beginning, as you say. But I mean, mix it up a little bit. But let's talk a little bit also about this question of Jay Inslee. He wrote a piece about Jay Inslee, and he has basically branded his campaign as one that is focused like a laser beam on climate change. He has certainly, pushed the limit, as it were. I don't know the limit, but within the limits of, I guess, American politics in terms of Washington State with climate. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll go into the sort of the dynamics in the campaign regarding that.
Yeah. So, we've seen this before a little bit. Of people running sort of single issue presidential campaigns designed to elevate a particular issue that they find existential. And we haven't seen it on climate in a Democratic primary before. Inslee is really the first one to try this. And there have been some sort of fortuitous circumstances around that, most notably this attention paid to the Green New Deal and the work of the Sunrise Movement and people like that. That has given sort of a path for Inslee to make this stand. And usually these single issue kind of candidates aren't necessarily running to be president, although I think Inslee has certain qualifications in that regard. They're running to make sure that issue is a priority, that it's front and center within the context of the party that they're trying to influence. And I think Inslee is doing a pretty good job of that. He's setting sort of a gold standard in terms of his policies. He has successfully, I believe, connected climate to all of these other challenges that we face, whether it's the declining share of the labor movement, because there's a labor component to his climate change policy. The state of the economy, of green manufacturing, of economic growth, and returning the country to a dominant position in certain industries. He's connected it to immigration with this concept of climate migrants and how our foreign policy might be better served by helping these countries be sustainable and successful on their own right, rather than getting millions of their people at our border, like we're seeing particularly in Guatemala, where harvests are dying rapidly, and climate migrants are coming to the United States because they have simply no other option. So you see it in an immigration context and also in a sort of international relations context. He's talked about trade deals needing environmental components at the forefront. He's talked about international cooperation on the climate crisis. So, the ability to sort of connect to that, this fundamental challenge to these other issues, I think is very important because it really centers climate at the core. And, I think he's been pretty successful in getting other candidates within this primary race to move in his direction, much like we're seeing in a dynamic with Elizabeth Warren sort of more generally, where she's put out these plans and now everybody is scrambling to put out their own plans. In a climate context, that is the dynamic that Inslee is facilitating, and I think that's a really good role. Above and beyond the fact that he does have a pretty decent record on a number of issues.
So what he wanted this debate, the DNC said no. It seems to me like there's a potential here, and I don't know. I have not been paying attention to that sort of discourse around there, but it seems to me like we're two candidates who are in the middle of the pack could just basically say, we're going to do this. And the DNC would then be in a position of basically bumping those people from future debates because they want to go on and talk about climate change. That seems like a fairly...
Yeah, I think this is an organizing opportunity. And I think Inslee and his campaign sees it that way. And they're not going to stop. The two candidates that sort of jumped aboard in reiterating that there should be a climate debate were Elizabeth Warren and Beto O'Rourke. So two of the candidates in the upper tiers, I would put Warren in the top tier and Beto just below that at this point. But, if there's a coalition that can be built, a larger one of 10 candidates, 12 candidates that say, we're just going to go ahead and do this, that puts a lot of pressure on the DNC. That would make it very difficult for the DNC to sort of continue this stance, that because their position is that if you do an outside debate, we're going to disqualify you from any DNC debates. We're not going to invite you anymore. And I should say that that's a new rule. That isn't some sort of iron law that the DNC gets to manage what candidates can say in large formats, televised formats, in debates. We saw plenty of debates in 2008 that were not sanctioned by the DNC. I remember going to one at Yearly Coast, which is now
right.
Netroots Nation 2007. This was something that Debbie Wasserman Schultz implemented in 2016.
Right.
This idea that you can't do outside debates, and it's a bit silly. I mean, it's really a micromanagement kind of situation where you're trying to manage the access and of these candidates in ways that I don't really understand. So I think it's ripe for challenge. I think if you get enough, a tipping point of candidates to participate in a debate of that kind, particularly if you get the front runner, Joe Biden, who put out a climate policy this week that got some generally good, a little bit mixed reviews, and was certainly closer to an Inslee type of, although it wasn't at that level, it was closer to it than the sort of middle ground that he was looking for in published reports with members of his staff. So, if you can get a good number of people, I think you can sort of call the bluff of the DNC on this.
I feel like if Warren, Beto, Sanders, Inslee, and Harris all said that we're going to do this, I mean, what are they going to do? Not let those people on the debate stage? I mean,
it seems crazy that would be the outcome, and that would sort of be the end of that. So, as I said, I think it's an organizing opportunity for Inslee, and then an opportunity for him to continue into this area.
Let's talk a little bit. I want to just change topics a little bit, because the other big thing this week that, and part of that is our own myopia here on some level, but there was on Twitter, as an extension of YouTube, a controversy that was a function of Carlos Maca. Is that it? Is his name? I keep Maza. Is a Vox YouTuber, and he does these explainers. I've seen one or two.
Think about what you would have said if someone said to you 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he's a Vox YouTuber.
Right.
And that's a job that you can have.
Well, that's the weird thing about this. I mean, because, like on some level, I'm quite convinced that this is in some fashion or another the future. I don't know if it's going to be YouTube, and I don't know if it's going to be Vox, but it's going to be two other words that we can't even imagine what they mean from 10 years from now. But it's going to be some measure of this, or not. I mean, because part of it is that in 2004 there was no YouTube. Kicked in, I think, later that year or something, and now it is a dominant platform. The Steven Crowder would address these explainers and always make a point about the fact that Maza was gay and Mexican, and basically just gay bash. Crowder has a lot of other things that I find ridiculous and stupid about him, but this is I think the one that sort of certainly runs contrary to YouTube's terms of service. And so Maza complained to YouTube, and they basically said to Steven Crowder, we're no longer monetizing your channel until you get rid of all the gay bashing, which to me seems fairly appropriate. I think there's other problems with YouTube from an antitrust perspective, and from the role.
Yeah, I mean, I did. Let me just jump in. I think Steven Crowder is now seeing the problems with a narrowed distribution channel where there's only one way to get your communication out. The problem here seems to be that if there was an environment where you had all sorts of opportunities to distribute video content, then there would be the market would sort of figure out where people go, and this demonetization sort of threat hanging over the heads of every single YouTuber would be neutralized. But in this case, that's not the landscape that we have. And YouTube has this tremendous amount of power at their own whim to decide whether or not to cut off the livelihood of individuals. Now, I don't agree with Steven Crowder. I don't even know Steven Crowder until you told me we were going to be talking about this an hour or so ago.
You live a charmed life.
What I do know is that should an organization like YouTube have the power to turn on or off the potential livelihood of individuals based on the amount of lobbying they get from the outside, or based on their own particular political or public relations whim. No, and that's I think the major problem here. I'm not clued in necessarily to this debate, but what I would say is that this is a problem of a concentrated distribution network.
Right, and the it seems to me, I mean, obviously YouTube is not in a position to diversify, and to break themselves up. So you've been looking into this for a long time. What how would that work, right? Like what would be, and I know there's plans out there, but I think people have a hard time sort of conceiving of this, because look, you could put your videos on Vimeo. There are other platforms for video content. There's other ways to monetize YouTube stuff. We had an ad apocalypse about a year and a half ago, and a lot of YouTubers basically said support the show on Patreon in some fashion, and it was perfectly effective for them. But the idea.
So here's what I would say.
Go ahead.
This is obviously part of the larger thing, because when we're talking about YouTube, we're talking about Google. Google bought YouTube way back in 2006 or 7 or something, and Google. Eric Schmidt, the former executive chairman of Google, has said in the past that Google would make an acquisition per week of other applications, other potential rivals, things like that. So the easiest way to sort of go about this is just reverse a lot of that. And with Google, maybe you're talking about YouTube, but you're probably definitely talking about DoubleClick, which is the ad serving software that they. This is what has enabled Google to not just be an ad destination, but an advertising supplier and facilitator. So it's bring forth an ad exchange, an actual market to put advertisers and users together, while also competing with them. So this is sort of the bigger problem. When you're talking about Amazon, maybe you're talking about splitting Zappos, which was an emerging site until Amazon bought them, or splitting it from Amazon Web Services, which is sort of the firmament, this cloud network that undergirds a giant portion of the internet. When you're talking about Facebook, it's the direct competitors to them they've bought, Instagram and WhatsApp. So just reversing those mergers, number one, would decentralize the power to a certain extent.
So what? So
as far as
for YouTube, just give me an example. So all right, so we separate YouTube from Google. We separate YouTube from AdSense. And then what happens? It becomes just less.
Well, I mean, the fundamental point here is that Google's ownership of YouTube has been a driving force in moving users looking for videos into YouTube, right? And if you sever that relationship, then maybe if you're searching, you're not necessarily only getting Google. You're not necessarily only getting YouTube responses to your queries on Google. So that's one way in which this can manifest. The other way is that it is the role of the competition authorities to make sure that we can provide some of that. And maybe there's a role for a public-facing network or fostering some sort of competition within there. And then the third thing would be a regulatory impact. So, I mean, the problem with Google, and it's come up this week, is that their algorithm, which requires or prefers, I should say, a certain amount of engagement, has inevitably sends people down these rabbit holes of conspiracy and makes it easy for pedophiles to find certain bits of content, and that algorithmic problem is one that, in my view, could be regulated so that Google can be, or YouTube can be a network that isn't promoting hatred or promoting or at least moving people into that direction. But my general thought is that the more competition there is, you fight speech with more speech, and everybody can sort of find their level.
And we could also, from a regulatory standpoint, assuming that the industry that we're regulating wasn't so massive and powerful as to essentially own the regulatory agencies, we could also say something to the effect of like, hey, if you're going to be in that algorithms can only be relied upon so much in the context of this type of industry or that type of industry, right? I mean, like, part of the problem that that Google has with maintaining the its own terms of service is that they don't want to deploy the number of people that is necessary to actually look at this stuff and get it right. So you get you demonetize Steven Crowder, but you're also demonetizing somebody who does, historical analysis of speeches of Hitler, as opposed to putting Hitler on there and praising him, and how these things are mediated makes a difference. I mean, context makes a difference.
I think with First Amendment being what it is, that really, going into this and putting it on a YouTube, a private government, to regulate its own speech, I think is problematic. But what I would say is that in my view, the way to really deal with all this is you ban targeted ads. And what that would do, and I think there is a clear path to be able to do that, and I don't think it does actually call up First Amendment problems, is you just say that you can't track and surveil somebody around the web and then serve them very specific and particular, quote unquote, relevant advertising at every step of the way. And what that would do is that YouTube wouldn't not have an ad business under that form. It still has a big audience. It still could do research on that audience and know generally what that audience is, and then tell advertisers, well, we have a lot of people who, are in this age range or who have these certain interests. But then everybody would get to do that. And so the Wall Street Journal, which has a very high concentration of decision makers and businesses, could go to their advertisers and say, this is what our market is, rather than now where Google and Facebook steal this market share by being able to geo-target those individuals very specifically, giving no reason for you to build up an audience of any kind of specialness, and be able to serve the ads within that community. So if you have that...
All right, let me just see if I can restate that to you so that to make sure that I understand what you're saying, that there is an unfair advantage that a Facebook and a Google has in the advertising market that basically makes it impossible for anybody, content creators, for, let's use a rather vulgar term for people, doing journalism or whatever it is, for content creators to compete with these outlets, so that I can't go to an advertiser and say, hey, I have, whatever. I mean, if I was to do a survey and say, okay, I have people from 25 to 55 who, make anywhere from $35,000 to $100,000 a year, and they're interested in, that's the depth of the data that I can get. They're interested in rock climbing, but YouTube, or I should say Google and Facebook, can go like, oh, we can not only tell you, we can tell you the zip code they live in, we can tell you the magazines they buy, what their search terms are.
Right. And if you want a universe of 50,000 people who like rock climbing, we can give you those 50,000 people, like who we know like rock climbing because we read their email.
With a 1-to-1 yield, as opposed to what Sam Seder can do, or the Washington Post can do, or anybody else can do.
Or Rock Climbing Magazine, right? So, you know, it has ruined sort of the uniqueness of these particular universes, these demographic markets within, you know, content creators, to use your word. And so if you eliminated that, if you just said, look, for privacy reasons, we're not going to let you surveil us anymore, then everybody's on a more level playing field. And this whole, you know, demonetization thing might become less of an issue if you can build up an audience and say, hey, I have an audience that is pretty good for advertisers, and advertisers might want to come in. Because the monetization is around ads, right? I mean, that's what it is. It's you have an audience such that you can acquire ads on YouTube. Well, if you can sort of acquire ads on your own through your own separate service that isn't connected to Google, and you can make it survive because Google isn't essentially stealing the uniqueness of your market.
Right. Well,
then you have a different ecosystem. You have a different environment, and one that I think is better for individuals.
It's a fascinating dynamic and conversation. I think it's one we're going to hear more of, right? I mean, do you have that sense? Like, how? Let me ask you this then, just as a final question. There was an announcement this week that what is it? Delaney from Rhode Island is going to start hearings on this in the House. But there was also an announcement this week that the DOJ and the FTC had basically resolved who was going to be looking into this in terms of Google and Facebook and other big tech companies. How for reals do you think that is?
It's hard to know. I mean, I think that the investigation from the congressional side is real.
Right.
We know that Lena Khan, who has risen to some manner of prominence, who wrote this great law review paper about Amazon and antitrust, now works in Cicilline's office, and is going to be very involved with this investigation, which my view is it should be more wide-ranging than tech firms. I think that if we broke up Google, Facebook, and Amazon today, we'd still have a terrible concentration problem in America, and maybe it will go in that direction. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to do something like a PCORA commission for economic concentration, or a temporary national economic committee, which was this thing in FDR era that actually looked at economic concentration and really fomented a lot of really good law and moves by the antitrust authorities. As for the FTC and the Justice Department, it seems like they worked out some jurisdictional issues. We have this weird situation in America where we have two agencies that do antitrust enforcement, and there are no clear lines between who does what. It's just sort of thrown into one bucket after another, and there isn't this great coordination around it. And so the fact that they actually said, okay, you take this and we'll take that, it signals that, you know, they wouldn't do that if they weren't planning to do something, right? But what that's going to be, I mean, honestly, after seeing this group in place at the FTC and the Justice Department in the Trump era, you're just going to have to show me before I'm convinced that you're interested in rooting out anti-competitive behavior and really getting something done.
But in the event that there is a Democratic administration that is amenable to this, to changing the sort of the Chicago school Robert Bork regime of antitrust and return to one that is sort of broader in its perspective. It's nice to have this started there, I guess, right?
And I think that's why the Cicilline Committee is important, because that role is going to be to raise awareness, to identify these issues within the economy, to talk about the implications, to lay out a fact pattern of the role of, in this case, these tech companies, these digital platforms, in our everyday lives, and to do that in a high-profile way. And that's going to, simply have resonance with the next Democratic administration, particularly if it comes in 2020 and after the 2020 election. That's why I think that that will be an enduring set of facts about the state of the economy today that can then be used by the enforcement agencies. And we've seen that done before. We've seen it in the context, particularly of banks. I'm thinking about Carl Levin's great reports from the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations about Goldman Sachs and about HSBC. This was, right after the crisis, and then informed not just some of the enforcement priorities, but it also informed the actual policy making in Washington around Dodd-Frank. So, I am hopeful more for the committee's work and giving Congress a role again in economic policy making. I'm not so optimistic about Trump's FTC and Trump's antitrust division of the Justice Department, but we'll see.
David Dayen, always a pleasure. Folks should head over right now to, what is it? What is the URL?
Prospect.org.
Prospect.org. Sign up, subscribe to the Prospect, support David Dayen's work and the team that he's assembling over there. David, always a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And we'll have a lot more to say on the Prospect in coming weeks.
Great. All right, folks. David Dayen, ladies and gentlemen, an American treasure. How many years have I been saying that?